Okay, so thanks to everybody for joining us, and welcome to our Summer Standard Issue author panel. My name is Ben Wolfson. I'm an assistant editor-in-chief at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, and we're thrilled to have you here and to be showcasing some of the great articles that we published this year in the Summer Standard Issue. For anybody who doesn't know, JSPG is a nonprofit dedicated to elevating students, postdocs, policy fellows, and early career scholars in the science, technology, and innovation policy and governance debate worldwide. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary last year and are excited to be kicking off the next decade. I encourage you to sign up to our newsletter at this link I'm going to send to the chat now, if you haven't already, just so you can be aware of any events we have and of our calls for articles and deadlines. And we wouldn't exist without the submissions from early career science policy professionals. So I also want to mention that submissions are currently open for our next special issue on development policy and global change science to achieve the vision of sustainable Americas in partnership with the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. And if you have a paper on a general topic that you'd like to submit, submissions for the winter standard issue are closed, but our next summer standard issue will be opening up soon. So be sure to subscribe to the newsletter so you can see when those are open. And I'm looking forward to getting a chance to see the articles that you submit. So this summer issue was co-sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which, full disclosure, I am currently a participant in. And I would like to start by passing the mic to Jessica Soule to talk a bit about the fellowship.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. The AAAS S&T Policy Fellowships is really grateful to have partnered on volume 21 of JSPG this year and to have this networking opportunity today. I want to first start by thanking our published authors, especially the folks on the panel, Celien, Lauren, Soumya. We couldn't be here without you and your hard work. So thank you for contributing your policy ideas on such a wide range of issues that were covered in this edition. I also want to thank JSPG and its team for its continued work, coaching, elevating the next generation of science policy leaders. As JSPG, has just celebrated its 10th anniversary, as STPF celebrates its 50th anniversary, I'm reminded of how far science policy has come and that the demand for science policy expertise is accelerating. And thank you all for being here. And then last but not least, thank you, shout out to you, Ben. You're wearing so many hats, as JSPG's assistant editor-in-chief, as a current STPF fellow, and our moderator today. So really, thank you. And thank you all. Keep up the important work and happy, chatting and networking.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And so the way this is going to work is we're going to introduce our panelists, and then I'll have some questions in a moderated chat, but also I want to make sure that that's open to anybody in our audience. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand in Zoom or to put it in the chat and I can read it out for you. And I hope we have an interesting discussion. So I want to first introduce Soumya Somani. They're a student at Rice University pursuing a degree in health science and social policy analysis. Soumya conducts research in federal science policy as a student intern at the James Baker Institute for Public Policy and has previously researched at MD Anderson Cancer Center. They're interested in how science policy shapes the healthcare environment in the US and in the future hopes to contribute to public health policy to promote equity in medicine. Next, I want to introduce Lauren Hutnik. Lauren is a medical student at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School and a candidate for the Global Health Distinction Track. Lauren earned a BA in biology at New Jersey Institute of Technology and is passionate about advocating for equitable reproductive rights and engaging in discourse about the intersection of medical history and women's health. And finally, today we have Celien Stercke. They're a criminologist at the Institute for International Research on Criminal Policy and a member of the IMEC Distra Net, which is a research group in computer sciences at the KU Leuven. In 2022, she graduated from Ghent University with a master's in criminological sciences, and she aims to pursue a PhD on the intersection of her technical and social background, i.e. cyber warfare. Celien researches the applicability of governance of security theories to cyberspace, in particular cyber mercenaries, in order to develop governance architecture model scenarios to counter cyber threats. So thank you all of you for joining us. And I want to start by giving each of you some time to talk about your articles and tell us what you wrote about and what your policy conclusions were. Soumya, I'll go to you first.
Hi, everyone. So my article was about the new government agency, federal agency titled ARPA-H, or the Advanced Research Project Agency for Health. Essentially, this is an agency that was created to model after a few other agencies that already exist, like DARPA. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before, but they are agencies that kind of fast track different research projects in the United States in different areas. So DARPA is for defense. There is an equivalent in the intelligence realm called IARPA, and it's also an energy one as well. So ARPA-H was President Biden's new version of these ARPA agencies. And the idea was to promote two things. First, as we saw with COVID-19, like the fast tracking of different vaccination projects and diagnostic projects, and how that was basically an amazing feat that was conducted by scientists. So if we could utilize a similar framework on other existing issues such as diabetes or cancer, ARPA-H was designed to kind of create those fast track projects and help fund them as well. And the other aspect of ARPA-H that President Biden really, I guess, wanted to, was it part of his envisioning of this project agency, was the idea of health equity and promoting health equity through these research projects, which has been a growing focus of other federal agencies as well. But ARPA-H is specifically designed for both the advancement of these applied research projects, but also the promotion of these health equity ideals. And so my research article kind of focused on the history of both the framework which ARPA agencies work in, but also the idea of whether or not ARPA-H is even needed. There's quite a lot of debate about whether this agency deserves to be funded to the extent that the presidential administration hopes to have it funded. And if it is funded, what are some benefits that it can offer to the health policy realm and the biomedical research realm, but also what are some disadvantages of the current framework that are currently being utilized to set up ARPA-H. So some of my policy research focus was based on the idea that ARPA-H would be housed in the NIH, which was a really big point of contention for a lot of researchers and policymakers. So I kind of focused on that as a big portion of my article, but also focusing on the other ideas such as who should lead ARPA-H. There were quite a few viable candidates at the time I was writing my article. And so focusing on the characteristics of what ARPA-H should be for the future was kind of my conclusion, or the policy recommendation part of my article.
Great, thank you, Soumya, and I can't wait to dig into that a bit more as we get through this. So, Celien, I'll go to you next. Can you tell us a bit about your article, please?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'll dive right into it and take you with me into the world of autonomous weapon systems. So over the last decade, autonomous weapon systems, also known as killer robots, have been the subject of widespread debate. Autonomous weapons are systems that, once activated, can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. The systems have been under a primarily theoretical discussion to be banned preemptively for years, as they impose various ethical, legal, and societal questions, both in favor and against them. Think, for example, of all the lives that could be saved if we could replace soldiers by machines. But on the other hand, can we let a robot decide over life and death? These examples are merely the tip of the iceberg of the most prominent points raised and are more thoroughly discussed in the article, but it gives you an idea of the fundamental issues raised at the moment. So a potential ban came to the forefront due to early skepticism, strengthened by a launch of a campaign to stop killer robots by the Human Rights Watch in 2013. This movement has catalyzed an international regulation process on the level of the United Nations. Both a new protocol to the Convention on Conventional Weapons or an entirely new international treaty have been considered. In 2016, a group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems was installed and has led to the adoption of 11 non-binding guidelines in 2019. The preference has been given to an additional protocol to the convention. However, due to a lack of consensus, the further process is stalled, and as such, leaves autonomous weapon systems in a regulatory gray zone. Notwithstanding that even at the beginning of the policy debate, very advanced technological weaponry already existed, a true fire, forget, and find capability wasn't observed on the ground yet. The theory became practice in 2020 during the Libyan war, as for the first first time, the use of a true autonomous weapon system was noticed and, more importantly, attributed as such by the United Nations a year after the event. The renewed attention and momentum did not lead to any breakthrough, however, as today, there is still no specific regulatory framework for the weaponry. A potential way forward could be a so-called coalition of the willing through a new treaty, or agreeing on industrial quality and minimum standards through ISO norms. As such, this minimum set of rules or requirements could provide the necessary foundations of a governance framework for the weaponry and help the global status quo in moving forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Celien. And last but not least, Lauren, can you walk us through your article, please?
Sure. Hi, guys. Thanks for having me here today. So my article is basically discussing the Hyde Amendment, which talks about, essentially, it's been something that's gone in and out of policy making for quite a number of years. And basically, it says that you can't use federal funds for abortion coverage, except in the cases of incest, rape, and life endangerment. So on and off, it's been added as an appropriations bill and been discussed basically as a rider on top of other bills, on top of specifically an abortion appropriation, or rather an appropriation bill in itself. So basically, the question that I was kind of looking at was not necessarily about is abortion ethical and policy memo about that, but rather what are the financial implications of the Hyde Amendment and how does it really affect not only the individual woman, but how does that affect the American economy? So really, my article discussed how the Hyde Amendment not just impacts impoverished women, but really it impacts anyone that's federally insured. So Washington, D.C. residents, people that work in the Peace Corps, people that work in the military, they're all impacted. And it's kind of less talked about in the news compared to people that are impoverished. And the discussion is really centered around poverty and people using money and welfare systems, but rather let's focus on the bigger picture of how it really impacts so many other women on the whole, and really it's a larger problem than what we make it out to be. So it was just kind of also exploring the hypotheticals of if you were to fund abortion for people that wanted abortion, how does that impact people that are at the poverty level? And there was a lot of studies basically showing that women that are denied abortions are more likely to stay below the poverty level. And it's incredibly difficult to travel across different areas to get abortions. So basically discussing the finances of everything that goes into we have to consider for women, as well as the fact that the GDP would actually raise if more women were allowed, or not allowed, but rather given the funds to get desired abortions, more people go in the workforce, less poverty in general. So it was interesting writing this memo while Roe versus Wade was overturned, because actually as I submitted the memo, news came out that it was going to be overturned. So it was interesting for me to try to, once the memo was accepted, to try to find an evolution in the sense that I could still have my suggestions, of course, to be about the Hyde Amendment, but it almost became half obsolete because many of these states wouldn't really work under the Hyde Amendment anymore, wouldn't apply to them if they decided to stop abortion. So I tried to focus on something that was timely and would continue to evolve, such as basically crossing borders to find care. That was something that was interesting in EMTALA, emergency care. So really looking at that and President Biden's executive order and how that was going to affect women. So that was my interesting dynamic that I had to work through with my partners. And so it's an ongoing issue and it's very interesting to keep up with.
Yeah, so that's something I want to dig into a bit more with all three of you, is what it was like to be working on these articles as policy is shifting and as, you know, the news is happening and life is changing and things are, I mean, the Dobbs, you know, yeah, like Roe v. Wade is getting overturned. But so, like, Lauren, what is the actual, what's going on with the Hyde Amendment now? Like, does it matter anymore in this new world, or is it kind of by the wayside?
Yeah, so the EACH Act is something that was actually, I discussed in my memo, is something that would have, prior to Dobbs' decision, would be used as a way to confirm and make sure that the Hyde Amendment didn't happen permanently, that it would permanently prevent this restriction on federal funding. So that an aspect can still be explored. But again, in a sense, it is obsolete for those many states. There's about 13 states right now that have almost near abortion bans. So for those states, you could hypothetically keep thinking about the Hyde Amendment, but nobody can hold, it's kind of hard as well, thinking about the intersection between federal laws and state laws now, in terms of also like OBGYN practices as well, just considering one provider is told you can't do that at the state level, but the federal level, like in TALA, Hyde Amendment, et cetera, are kind of having these interchanging rules. So it is quite literally an ongoing thing. News keeps coming out about women's barriers to care. So it really is something that's just quite a big question mark. And even with OBGYN providers like being in the field and applying to this field right now for residency, really nobody knows what's going to happen in some of these states.
I mean, so as a someone who's in medical school right now, what are your instructors telling you about it? Is that something that's being discussed?
Yeah, so I'm in Jersey, so we have very good abortion law protection. And I personally applied and have been taking interviews only from places that are in the Northeast. So for the most part, and even in Pennsylvania, which recently had, you know, the election, that was a pivotal election, and there's liberal lawmakers in power, there's been discussion basically of like continuing to safeguard family planning practices and encourage that the residents do learn. Of course, they're allowed to opt out if they feel like desired to, but making sure that the access is there and advocating for the patients to have that access. So people are basically doubling down in the areas, but I've also heard people in more conservative states are having a lot of troubles in the sense that they'll hypothetically send somebody to basically a clinic where, or the residents to a clinic where it's trying to convince women out of abortion. So it's not necessarily learning miscarriage management, abortion management, et cetera. It's more of, becomes politicized. So there is that aspect that training now is going to be definitely impacted. There's also, I think, a lot of more competition happening with the residency process, because I think a lot of people interested in OBGYN are trying to flood the Northeast areas, and like, we'll see when the numbers come out really. And I would love to, you know, keep everybody updated, but I definitely think it's a pivotal year for this field.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that aspect of it. So I want to move briefly from, you know, state versus federal laws to the international arena with Celien. And, you know, since you started, I guess ongoing through your drafting process has been the war in Ukraine, which is kind of the first large-scale war to use commercial drones in the way they are being used. In the news in America, I think this week or last week, was articles about the San Francisco Police Department using lethal robots, which are, you know, remote control, not autonomous. But this is all very bubbling up through the ether right now. What kind of shifts in policy were you seeing as you were drafting and then going through the editorial process for your article? And, you know, what's changed now compared to when you started?
Yeah, well, a lot changed, I would say. Like, it's very like what Lauren spoke about. Like, it's a very ongoing process. I think it's the same for my topic as well. I also wrote it down as, in other words, it's like your review, even if it's like mostly done, it's never really finished because it is such an ongoing thing. And yeah, between me starting my draft and publicizing, I know it was from a primarily theoretical debate when I was writing it, and it was to be banned preemptively when it wasn't necessarily there on the ground. Yeah, the United Nations attributed a system as an autonomous weapon system. So they actually became into practice, which is a whole other level to like limit something that's actually already existing, and they are using it without any framework whatsoever for using it. So I think it will be very interesting also towards the future. Now you mentioned also the war going on with both sides having violations of international humanitarian law, and I assume it will come for the international court. And I think maybe it will take until then to actually have a framework, because it's now so ongoing, they are not necessarily interested in like discussing a framework at this moment, because Russia is also a partner at the table. So yeah, with the ongoing events, it's really impacted by the context it's going in. It's not necessarily just a framework. It operates within the whole world context, I would say. So yeah.
And on the global stage, what is the process for creating that sort of framework look like?
Well, now they're still looking at the Convention on Conventional Weapons, but actually just recently, on the 21st of October, on the General Assembly of the United Nations, they vocalized the need for the framework as well. So maybe also on the level of the United Nations, there can be worked upon a draft of something, I would say. I think it will be way more multilateral to like also apply to, not necessarily everyone, but I think for most the United Nations would be the good way to do so. I don't necessarily think the conventional weapons is now a bit hampered by they need consensus, which also I outlined in my article, and that reaches, that leaves us at the status quo we're in today. So it's I would say difficult dynamic, because the conventional weapons seems to be the perfect fit, so to speak, to have an additional protocol on such weaponry, but in reality it doesn't really make it into a framework at this moment in time, I would say.
Yeah, and I feel like, we're in a bit of a moment with machine learning and AI right now, with the generative image algorithms and ChatGPT and stuff like that. Do you think that the way that is changing the conversation about AI is going to have an impact on that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely, because the technology is changing so fast, and it's not necessarily for autonomous weapon systems of artificial intelligence, but it's like a bigger tendency that laws like kind of come after the technology, because they go so fast. It's really hard to capture technology before it even arises, I would say. Also, everything going on with machine learning and artificial intelligence is directly important for autonomous weapon systems, because it's like, they're based upon it, I would say. So definitely, I see big impact, but I think there's a difference between the commercial side and between the military side. So I assume there would be differences still, but for sure they have big impacts. And now I recall upon you mentioning the police using robots, so to speak, for use of force. I think it's very important to take that into account as well, because it's only now in a warfare context, I would say, that they have been discussed. But I think they can raise some concerns in a policing context as well. So it's good to have a framework to know where the lines are, because now they're just open freely, and mostly that has been shown to that something needs to go wrong first before they would like make a framework. It would be sad to see so if we know in advance they have some concerns, I would say.
Yeah, I think some of the most harrowing imagery coming out of like China's quarantine has been the drones yelling at citizens to go back inside. And again, not autonomous, but the ways that technology is changing the way that police and law and the government interacts with citizenry is disconcerting. Soumya, you had the privilege of writing about something in federal policy that then happened by the time you were done writing about it. Where was ARPA-H when you started, and how did that process go? It felt like a relatively rapid instantiation of a new federal agency. So how did that go for you?
Yeah, so ARPA-H as a concept has been around for quite a long time, actually. The organization that's based off of, or the agency it's based off of, is called DARPA, like I mentioned before, the defense agency. And DARPA has been extremely successful. Like they helped create the internet, mRNA vaccinations, like a lot of different things that we use today actually comes from DARPA's research. And so the idea of having ARPA-H was not something that was like unfamiliar, but with COVID-19, when people saw how high risk, high reward research could actually pay off with like significant benefits, I think ARPA-H as a concept became a lot more solidified, and there was almost a proof of concept essentially that policymakers could kind of point towards with COVID-19. So at the beginning of when I started to write my article, ARPA-H was already quite like, I guess, ready to be established. The White House already had, I guess, like a mission statement ready, and the ideas that they wanted to incorporate in the agency, they were all like pretty much laid out. And Congress at the time was also debating passing the ARPA-H Act. And so the only thing that was kind of changing throughout my entire writing process was a few details, including a key couple ones, like the idea of whether or not ARPA-H should be housed in the NIH, which actually has a lot of ramifications on the effect that ARPA-H could have. So the whole reason that ARPA-H wanted to be established as an agency was the idea that NIH is very slow technically as an agency. They focus more on foundational research. And so the idea of like having building block research versus advanced or really accelerated research as a different agency was kind of a key point. So you didn't want to have NIH's influence cloud ARPA-H's work. And so that was a debate that was the prominent discussion during the time I was writing between the White House and Congress. And just seeing the evolution of that through like policy memos or reports from legislative committee hearings, those were the things that kind of used to keep track of what was going on. And as of right now, I do know that ARPA-H is established within the NIH, and they have their own website now, they have their own director. So it is very much like, it's been funded as well, although not to the same extent that it was hoped to be funded. So it's very much like ongoing, and I think hopefully we'll see like some cool projects or research come out of ARPA-H as well soon. So yeah.
So I was curious, when you were talking about the article, you mentioned about how one of the things that pushed ARPA-H forward was seeing how successful the government was in getting COVID vaccines rapidly. But I feel like so much of that process was less about the science and more about cutting through bureaucracy and making, requirements less stringent and just getting them into arms faster. How do you think ARPA-H will have an impact on that sort of thing in the future?
Yeah, so ARPA-H as an organization is modeled after DARPA, and DARPA is considered a flat bureaucracy. So that essentially allows there to be like one director and then hundreds of different project managers. And so these project managers have quite a lot of discretion on their hands about like which projects they want to select. There's not a lot of like grant writing as in the NIH. So because of like a lot of the paperwork is reduced, and these project managers have so much discretion about what they want to fund, and they also have a very limited time frame. They only have 3 to 5 years to actually produce results before they're no longer part of ARPA-H. So that small timeline and just a lot of discretion kind of allows these projects to be faster than what NIH would do as well. And I do know that because ARPA-H has these project managers, there's a lot of like issues surrounding how would you keep these project managers accountable, since they will be leaving within 3 to 5 years most likely. So that was another thing I try to address in my recommendations as well. But I do think that having a flat, nimble organization will make it much more easier to replicate what was done during COVID.
I think it's interesting because we're seeing so many different kind of DARPA style agencies pop up. Both, you were saying that this is just the latest of the ones in America, but we also have them coming into existence in Britain and Germany and throughout the world. Why do you think this is? And do you think that your analysis of ARPA-H could be extrapolated to those other agencies?
So while I was writing my article, I did look into those other countries that were kind of creating these frameworks. And there definitely is a lot of overlap in the missions behind them. I do know with ARPA-H, though, the idea was really to diversify the US's biomedical research strategy. At the current moment, it's very, well, it's not very focused, but it has a really significant focus on like foundational research. And that's what the government truly supports, because corporations, for example, won't take up the onus of foundational research without having significant profits from them. So that is like a maybe more US specific issue that was being encountered, but it is very applicable to other places as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a question kind of for all three of you, so whoever unmutes first. But as you know, in all of your papers, you put forth some, proposals or solutions to problems that you identified. Have any of those happened since you published or since you finished writing, or just kind of been taken off the table as even an option? No?
I can share a couple things. So I think I do know for a fact that since one of my main pieces of recommendation was to establish it separately from NIH, and that did not end up happening, unfortunately. Well, the ramifications of that aren't haven't manifested yet. So what I would think would happen hasn't happened yet. So that's, I guess, good. And secondly, with the budgeting, so I did talk a little bit about the idea of ARPA-H stealing from NIH's budget, because if they were separate from each other, then they would compete with funds. But if they were together, then a lot of NIH's funding would go to ARPA-H, but that didn't end up happening, which is also great. I think that there's a lot more to happen since ARPA-H is so new that some of the ramifications that I mentioned were more long-term. So we'll have to see whether or not ARPA-H is actually, like, being part of NIH has these effects. And then in terms of choosing a director for the new agency, the characteristics that I mentioned of the new leader, the person in charge now, the director now, she actually does check a lot of those boxes that I hope to have checked. And that's great to see. Like, the initial issue was potentially choosing Dr. Francis Collins as the new ARPA-H director. And that was like a thing that was quite ongoing when I was writing my article, but that didn't end up happening, which is great because there were a lot of issues with choosing someone like him. So yeah, just seeing like some of the other characteristics match up with a new director was great as well. Thank you.
Lauren, did I see you about to unmute?
Yeah, so I thought I'd actually kind of go through each recommendation. So I had three main ones. The first one was a bit more creative and something that I believe like you would really have to read my policy memo and think about. So basically what I was proposing is there are a lot of informal barriers to care on top of financial ones. So my proposal was basically have a kind of middleman advocating for women. So women, when they had informal barriers to care, like bureaucracy issues, having someone basically go forward and advocate anonymously so that a woman wasn't basically doing that for herself and uncomfortable and et cetera. And there was basically a backed up organization that had some credibility. So that's nothing, I personally haven't seen that been implicated yet or implemented rather. The EACH Act itself, that is something that, again, I believe it continues to be brought up. Right now, they're talking again about appropriation bills and riders, and a Hyde Amendment is every year talks about as a rider on how we're spending federal money. So again, that's something that's going to be talked about. But more so, I think this discussion is also talking about intersection or interstate travel, and will taxpayers want to pay for interstate travel? Is that something fair to ask for a woman that's coming from a more conservative state to go somewhere that they can get care? So that's something that's a hot topic at the moment. And then finally is really the EMTALA issue continues to be something that I think it is going to take more cases and more anecdotal stories to talk about, like really EMTALA care and the contradiction between providers versus the state rules versus federal rules, to really get something in motion and talking about how are we going to make this executive order President Biden put in place a permanent reality versus rescinding that. So that's, again, a hot topic that continues to evolve.
Great, thank you, Lauren. And Celien, I know you kind of covered your proposals already in your talk, but how about any of the problems you identified in your article? Have they become more visible through what's been happening in the world since you published, or are they just kind of trucking along like these are the problems that need to be solved the same?
Yeah, well, first, maybe one of my two proposals, so to speak, there has been more support, I would say, for another international treaty by the European Union and 70 other states recently advocating for a framework at the UN General Assembly. So there is a growing support, but there isn't really a change, I would say, in the policy solution, so to speak. And yeah, for the problems, I think because they are being used now, they are being observed, and I think probably the problem analysis will be done after after the war, because I think the war is now the first point of reference to look at them, and as they are being used as well. But they're like, I think now bigger problems than just those systems going on, and that they're like a bit sidelined in because of other problematic issues that are raising. But for sure, with the other growing technology, they keep advancing, and I think we'll see afterwards how this will be handled. But I think an interesting road, so to speak, is like criminal liability, but for states in a warfare context. So I think after the war ends, if it would get so far to the international court, I really think a lot will be cleared upon then, also judicial and internationally, and really the problems, because they are now like used and, so to speak, tested as how they actually operate in an operational environment, because before they were they only appeared in 2020, so we're only two years, almost 3 years further. It's still some time to see how they operate, I would say, and whether they can actually whether the technology is good enough to make the decisions. I would say there are some issues also regarding this decision making and robotics besides autonomous weapon systems. So it really is dependent on so many factors, I would say. So keeping track of each one of them is very interesting, but seeing how they operate in a battlefield as we speak now, I think the bill will be made afterwards, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And to ask a bit about the writing and researching process itself, what was your strategy? I'll start with you still. What was your strategy for making sure that you were on top of everything that was happening? And when did you know that you just kind of had to cut it? And it's like, this is, at some point you have to publish, and it is what it is, and it'll become out of date, and that's fine. But how did you know that point?
Is the question still for me? Because
oh yeah, sorry.
I'll
come to you first.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but a difficult one, because it never really feels like the right time. I think you just come to a point that it's like you did all your work, and you make like an overview, and then I frequently checked upon whether there have been some advancements. Also, before this discussion, I looked it up, just because a lot can happen. So I think it's just like when I finished the article with the data I had, and then right before publicizing, you also you keep checking it before until the point you actually publish it, I would say. And then as it is published, I could like be okay with, okay, it's published at this date, and at this date this is a reference for everything that has been here before. So yeah, it's I think it's just doing the work, and of course, if nothing really significant happens, because I didn't really encounter really big changes, I would say, like for me the prime idea of a status quo kind of sticked. So I don't know how I would handle a different situation, whether they would have gotten a new international treaty, for example, because that would be a bigger change to manage. But I think it's just you're doing your review process, you do like, okay. And then after you have like, I had my document, I like just updated it, I would say. So there's like some baseline I started from, and then I just kept updating that until the day it was published for me personally, but I don't know how the others perceive that.
Yeah, I mean, so speaking of large changes that impact your article, Lauren, can you tell us a bit about what that was like? And you mentioned revising it to not necessarily de-emphasize the Hyde Amendment, but make sure that it was in the present day. But can you tell us about that process?
Sure. So it was interesting that when it was accepted, it was an evolving process of STOPS was coming out as a ruling. So really, what my partner and I were thinking of is that we really have to rework what our recommendations are. Like some of them are still relevant, but we do need to evolve them and think about now an entirely new political field. So, oh, sorry, my headphone's falling out. So basically, can you guys hear me? Does that work? Okay, good, thank you. Basically kind of thinking of what's going to be a timely thing that continues to be relevant now, because there are so many different like boxes that open that we could have explored, but what's the most relevant, what's the closest related to the financial aspect, the financial theme of our article. So basically going with EMTALA, that was something we thought was pretty interesting because it was something that would we foresee and continue to see becoming something that's contested and something that isn't clear cut, an intersection of, again, like national laws and federal laws and state laws and how those interplay between each other. So really for me was trying to, prior we had a lot of examples of certain states doing something that were illegal or not following the Hyde Amendment specifications, but it was kind of hard to try to keep such specific examples in because we could put that example in the month before in our first round of edits, and the next month that example didn't apply anymore. So I really try to keep it as broad as possible, but also as focused on the theme itself. So for me, that was important for both rounds of edits, is that it was going to be a huge change from what we originally intended to put out and what was accepted, but really rolling with the punches and keeping it relevant.
Yeah, and Soumya, how were you rolling with the punches, and how were you maintaining as high level of awareness of what was happening with ARPA-H as possible?
Yeah, so the good thing about congressional policy is that it's very slow. Luckily, Congress they take their time with a lot of things. So I think for me, the majority of the information I was actually getting about ARPA-H was through case studies of other ARPA agencies, because like I mentioned, they had a mission statement and values and ideals ready, but some of the more like nitty-gritty details about like the agency itself weren't available to the general public yet. So I made sure to mention this in my article, but there were a few extrapolations made from other agencies and how they work right now and their impacts on their respective like sectors. So that was a good way for me to kind of keep on track of what ARPA-H may look like once it's established. And in terms of any like ongoing changes, like I make sure to like watch a few committee hearings, look at reports. I know, like, for example, there were advocacy groups like the AEIC, the American Association for Medical Colleges. I used their policy reports, like write-ups after these hearings to kind of understand what was happening during the legislative sessions themselves. And that kind of helped me inform my article as well. So I think just relying on outside groups, if you're not so familiar with like the committee hearings themselves or the more internal details, could be helpful to inform your article. Yeah.
For anybody who hasn't watched a committee hearing, would you recommend it, or would you say stick to the report?
I think if you have time, it's good to hear the hearing, but sometimes not like a lot of the stuff in the hearing isn't actually applicable to like what you may be hoping to find for your article. So the reports are a great way to save time and find what you're looking for as well.
And so I know a lot of your research interests right now, Soumya, are about these federal agencies. But has the process of researching and writing in this article influenced what you want to do for your career trajectory at all as a early career, still in school individual? What is the impact of that been?
Yeah, I think what was most rewarding about this process was trying to put together case studies and evidence and create recommendations. And so that kind of led me down the trajectory of So prior to this, I was primarily like studying health science or biosciences, but I did end up adding like social policy to my curriculum load and trying to learn more about like the data side of things, like how do you analyze data and propose recommendations off of data. So the article definitely, like this process helped me significantly in finding that passion. And currently, like I'm still doing more research on like federal White House health policy, which having this background really makes it easier for me to read like more reports and understand the subject matter. And so like for right now, my mentor like jokingly calls me like, you're the only expert in this like specific niche topic. So it does help having this background significantly because now I know what I'm interested in and I can continue to like build my expertise in this area as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as a former cell biologist who very slowly made the transition to policy, it's never too early to start. I mean, so Lauren, kind of the same question. You're in med school, you're still looking to become a doctor, but how is this deep dive into policy impacted what you are envisioning for your future career and maybe the role that you think that practicing doctors should have in policy?
That's a good question. You know, being in residency interviews right now, I do speak about my memo a lot and how it really impacted my desire of what I want to do as, you know, when I finish like residency completely and I become an independent practitioner, I do want to keep advocating. I think a big part of the field of OBGYN is advocating for patient, whether that be on the national level with something as big and timely as this, or just, you know, like preventative health measures, woman empowerment in general. All of these things is just something that's ingrained in the field in the way that might not necessarily be the same internal medicine or surgery, etc. I mean, I'm sure they have their niches, but really OBGYN is just a huge field for that. So for me, it kind of reinforced that I want to keep doing that, and not just at the federal level, but really with the patients and making them aware of what's happening in the world is super important, how they can take control of their bodies, how they can keep themselves safe, healthy, etc. So I think really every time I talk about this in an interview, I say like, I think it's just a huge part of our field, as much as being like a clinical practitioner is just being somebody that can speak to their patients and tell them about what's going on in the news right now. So I think this has definitely helped me, you know, have so much more knowledge than I would have had before, really dive into something. I love ethics, I loved history, and this was a really beautiful way of tying in my interest in research as well. It's really interdisciplinary.
Celien, you know, I think in your bio, you talk about how you're maybe on your way to a PhD in a similar field. Can you tell us a bit about that and what the you know, how writing and researching the article has impacted that?
Yeah, well, I can happily say that I actually have granted a scholarship, so I'm actually a doctoral researcher as we speak.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. Well, first and foremost, the article was actually my way of finding my niche. So it has had a very big impact on my topic, because I was really for a long time searching for like what topic could like interest me for like 4 years. And I knew it was like cyber, but I didn't find like the real cyber component I was very interested in, and autonomous weapon systems, and foremost like the regulation process of it and like the international dynamic. I think it's very interesting because national, we think like that the laws and the rules apply as they apply, but in international context, it's very different. Rules aren't as strict, I would say, as we see it. International Criminal Court is, it only counts if you say that it counts, I would say, because you have to, as a country, you have to say like, I oblige to these rules, otherwise they don't apply. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic that we don't always see in our national context then. Because my research group is internationally scoped, but we do also a lot of national research. So it was very interesting to like broaden the scope, I would say, also to gain experience in writing an article on such a topic within my sphere. And I really learned a lot about the editing process and like the comments from the editors. It really broadened my view on it also. And I really think it will be helpful for me in the future as well. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, that was the impact of the article.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I'm sure all of our editors at JSPG would be very glad to hear that. So, we're getting up on time, but I think for a final question, I just wanted to ask all of you if you had any tips and advice for people who are thinking about submitting an article, thinking about writing an article, maybe on something that's in their field or something that they might just be interested in and want to dive deep on, for them as they look to the future, what would you tell them? I'll start with Soumya again.
I think in terms of like issue exploration, paying attention to the news is like one of the best ways to find something that you might be interested in. I know for me, ARPA-H was a very foreign concept when I first heard about it, but like looking into the history of it and its connection to COVID was like the reason why I wanted to do more research into this. So that's like one way in terms of finding a topic that might interest you. And in the case that if you already have like a topic that's like your passion, for example, I would try to connect with maybe some experts in the field or someone who may have more experience than you. For example, I had a mentor who like really helped me figure out and navigate a lot of like the like finding the resources to write a policy recommendation or a policy brief. And so like having someone there to kind of help you, especially if it's your first time, is really helpful. And I think a lot of times, like when I was first reaching out to people to get some help, it was a little nerve-wracking, but once I connected with someone who was very helpful, and I realized that a lot of people are actually quite open to like reviewing your article or giving feedback, and they tend to have a lot more to say and add and point you in like further research, further directions for research.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I
might have cut off.
Oh, did you cut off? Sorry. Yeah. Did you have more? Sorry.
No, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that JSPG does at times host training sessions on how to write memos and find your topics. So feel free, everybody, to subscribe to the newsletter and be aware of those. But Lauren, same question to you. Any advice for our future submitters?
Yeah, I think something really important is don't be scared of diving into something new. Again, like I personally hadn't done it. My partner was leading a science policy and advocacy group. He said that policy memo would be something he thinks I would really like. And I recruited my friend who's also applying for OBGYN, who was my main helper, as well as 2 attending physicians that are in the field of OBGYN. And really, we just kind of did a lot of brainstorming back and forth and tried our hand at it. And we kept evolving it, asked for feedback. So just really dive into it, have fun with it, and explore what you love. It's supposed to be a creative thing as much as it is an educational thing.
Fantastic. And then finally, Celien.
Yeah, I actually can't really add a lot to what has been said already. I think indeed, just like I would say, just do it first and foremost, and indeed explore things that you probably normally wouldn't. I'm actually a very quantitative researcher, and this is a really qualitative thing to do. For me personally, it could be different for other people, but it really gets you out of your comfort zone, I think, as a student for most, and even in the context of like school or university. For me, it was like that. I drafted it within a course, and the paper, and I was just like, this could be more than just the paper. And I was just like, okay, I'm just gonna give it a shot, and it turned out very great for me personally. So I would just say, don't overthink it too much, in the way that you shouldn't be hesitant to just try it. You can just give it a try and see where it goes, because you'll learn a lot from it either way, I think.
Yeah, very motivational and positive. Looking forward. I think just try it. And if you don't want to try it but still want to get involved, we are also always recruiting editors. So you can't be an author and an editor at the same time, but there's usually a call out for our next generation. With that, I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank you for sharing your thoughts about your papers and the writing process in general. I think this has been a great discussion. And also thanks to AAAS and Jessica for co-sponsoring the issue and being here for our panel. So have a great day, everybody. Thanks to those of you who came, and again, thanks to our panelists.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.